Hi everyone, welcome to the first episode of Frontpage, a series where we look at all the trending topics within League of Legends and try to find ways to make sense of all this information at once without being particularly volatile. Today we're focusing on the case of MVP for both Europe and the NALCS, trying to make sense of some of the voting structure and how it is that we crowned Trick and Reignover in particular as the MVPs, and looking at how we can perhaps think about the MVP ballot in a little bit of a different way. But first, we have to understand who votes for the MVPs in the first place. And the voting structure comes from three places. Place number one, Riot's LCS team, which includes broadcasters, content creators, casters, observers, statisticians. Place number two, journalists that cover the LCS, everything from the Score Esports to ESPN. And the third is the LCS teams. Now, each LCS team starting player is able to cast one vote, and the organization as itself is able to cast one vote as well. So in some ways, it's a fair balance of people. It's not just a popularity contest. But when we look at who won these MVPs in both the European LCS and the North American LCS, I think we'll see some of the nuances that might want us to rethink the way that we talk about the MVP structure. So let's just put it on the table and figure out who won the MVP and why this person is maybe or maybe not necessarily worthy of these awards or this accolade. So for Europe, we look at Trick as the winner of the European LCS MVP. We have runners-up including Perks, Steelback, and Forgiven, and the first team all European LCS includes Cabochard, Trick, Perks, Steelback, and Kasing. For the North American LCS, the winner is Reignover. The runners-up include Jensen, Wild Turtle, and Adrian. And no love for Pobelter, but we'll get to that too. And the first team, all North American LCS, is Huni, Reignover, Jensen, Wild Turtle, Adrian. So we see four of the five members of Immortals. Poor Pobelter once again. And I think when we talk about the MVP race, we think about it from two schools of thought, and I'm going to sort of paraphrase some of the language that was used by Kelsey Moser's most recent article. And so the first school of thought is, who is the best player during the regular split during the season? And going off of a definition, it's the player who contributes the most to the team's wins. And so this is the player that not only has performed well, but has also had his team positioned him to best utilize his strengths and even compensate for his weaknesses. We know that these players overall are incredibly skilled, but they do have some discrepancies or weaknesses. And she goes on to say that it doesn't mean that the winner of the MVP award is the best player in the league or even the best player on his team. And she settled on the idea that Trick is the European MVP, although there are some nods toward Ottawamne and Cabochard. The idea, or at least the sentiment that resonates well, is that G2's playstyle is almost entirely about setting Trick up to succeed, and he uses that potential. He uses the way that they play as a way to enable other people, and so we see the cyclical relationship, right? We see that Trick is set up by Perks. He allows, by Perks pushing the mid wave, wave after wave, we see that Perks is able to continue staying mid and allow Trick to make plays across the map, including counter jungling, including actual ganks as well. The one thing that I have a problem with this general idea of what constitutes an MVP from, let's say, the best player in the league, is that we're also not thinking about the inverse of that, is how is it that they individually contribute to the success of their teammates? How do they help to get everyone involved? What are the things that make them the best players? And I do think, since we are seeing two of the top teams gaining the MVP status with their players, we do see that the junglers. And I think from a visual perspective, it makes sense because we are seeing from a kill participation standpoint, junglers are in most of the ganks, they're in most of the first bloods, they're the individuals who are around the map, and our cameras are fixated on them. So it makes sense as to why we would think Trick and Reignover. The second school of thought, and this is a school of thought that I want to introduce, or at least talk about on a bigger scale, is this idea of wins above replacement, which is a very complicated mathematical formula developed by Kevin Pelton. It's part of the sabermetrics and all this sort of baseball, basketball. If you've seen the movie Moneyball, the idea is essentially there. But I want to propose it in a way that we're stepping away from the internet realm here. We're not pulling out KDA, we're not pulling out stats. We're thinking about this from a more traditional sports perspective, the barbershop talks, like having conversations with people just based on the eye test. So the way that we think about this idea of wins above replacement is that we were to take the player and the team, and we were to separate them into two teams entirely. Team 1 includes the player that is in the conversation right here, and 4 average players around him, okay? And Team 2 is 4 of the current teammates of that player, and then 1 average player in that person's spot. So essentially what we're doing is we're trying to see if we were to replace this player with someone who is the average player within this, how would they perform? Now, thankfully, it's a little bit easier for us because we see that G2 and Immortals are the top teams. So I went ahead and picked sort of the middle of the pack, a little bit lower for these teams, and try to do sort of a visual replacement, how the teams would function. So for our purposes, for Europe, we're looking at G2, a team that's comprised of Kikis, Trick, Perks, Emperor, and Hybrid. And then we're going to look at a middle of the pack team like Elements, where it has Steve, Gilius, Ica, Miseralis, and Spraddle, or formerly Promiscu. So the idea here, and this is the way that I'm assessing the MVP, is if we were to take the crowned MVP in Trick, and we were to replace him with Gilius, what changes would we see? Not only in the changes of G2, but the changes of Elements. Now, my argument is that you wouldn't necessarily see Elements perform better than they already have, given Trick as a jungler, mostly because, and this is a point that resonates a lot, mostly because the mid lane and the jungler need cohesion. They need to function as a unit to be able to make this happen. Perks needs Trick just as Trick needs Perks. Without the aggression of Perks, Trick isn't enabled to make those plays. So let's look at this in North America, because I think we'll start to see this a little bit more, maybe even more so extrapolated within the North American example. Let's compare the top team in Immortals, almost perfect season, Reignover, Huni, Pobelter, Wild Turtle, Adrian, and then a middle of the pack team that shouldn't be middle of the pack, but I'll say that for another video, in TSM. Team comprised of Haunter, Svenskeren, you already see where this is going, Bjergsen, Doublelift, and Yellowstar. Yellowstar being the former 2015 Summer Split MVP. So let's think about it this way. If we were to take out Reignover, an incredible jungler, a lot of controversy coming up about him being the Fnatic main shot caller in the past season, where they went to the quarterfinals at Worlds, as opposed to Yellowstar, but all of that is hearsay. Let's compare Reignover to Svenskeren. Svenskeren, who is receiving a lot of flack from the online community, from Reddit in particular, about his performances. So let's swap those players. Let's do a quick visualization. Does Immortals win 17 games with Huni, Svenskeren, Pobelter, Wild Turtle, and Adrian? Does TSM win more than 9 games with Haunter, Reignover, Bjergsen, Doublelift, and Yellowstar? Context is very important here. We know that given this hypothetical example, that Yellowstar, Bora has worked with Reignover in the past. They created this amazing team that went undefeated in the previous, again, back to the quarterfinals. And ultimately, we're starting to see that the way that we conceptualize, the way that we talk about the MVP needs to be shifted a little bit, because we can very much so nitpick certain statistics when it comes to KDA, kill participation, deaths. We ultimately are sort of shooting ourselves in the foot in a way, because it's very hard for us to absolutely define what stat is most important. At a certain point, we're nitpicking. We're saying, oh, well, this player had a higher KDA and it had a higher kill participation. He's better. But if we actually look at Reignover in particular as an MVP, and we compare his stats across the board with the rest of the members on his team, including Pobelter, who got snubbed on the first team, although Jensen's worthy as well, we'll see that that Reignover is actually less intensive when it comes to the KDA on his team. He's the third. When it comes to the gold per minute, which makes sense from a jungler, he's past Huni, he's past Pobelter, he's past Wild Turtle. So who are the MVPs? I think that's ultimately what this boils down to. If we're doing this, replacing the player, the average wins above replacement, who are the real MVPs? And I don't think it's really simple. And actually, truth be told, given my criticism in this conversation entirely, I do think that Trick and Reignover are absolutely worthy of it. But I want us to think about this from a different vantage point. For Europe, I think a team like H2K does not function like H2K without Forgiven. Now, the H2K lineup's stacked. We even saw that Ryu left for a little bit and he was replaced, and they still performed well given his visa issues. The team is, for the most part, incredible. Odoamne, Jankos and Vander, two players who have been longtime teammates. When it comes to the macro game, the support and jungler obviously control a lot of that. So maybe we could just plug and play. Maybe we could put Steelback in Forgiven's position, and Steelback was one of the MVP runner-ups, which I highly disagree with. He was the shining star on a really okay team, and I think that is the type of statistics, the KDA, that we start to blow up, and it's a misrepresentation of a player's actual value. But ultimately, I would be fine with Forgiven, perhaps, as the MVP, or, and I think this is the problem with having Trick, is that there is no Trick without perks, and vice versa. So I think you could really nominate either of those players, and we do see that within the running of being the MVP. And then for North America, and this is where the internet and I, for once, agree, I think a player like Aframu is completely snubbed. I think when we're thinking about the win percentages, that oftentimes guides our judgment, right? So only the top one or two teams can have a player that's an MVP just because we think about winning, and winning is all that's important. So let's take a team like CLG. Okay, CLG being the second team in North America, worthy of having an MVP. They might not have the star collection of people like in Immortals, but they're second place with 13-5. That's pretty good. When we think about CLG, let's think about the roster. Darshan, Smithy, Huhi, Stixay, who, if not for Dardok's performance, would be Rookie of the Year, outstanding rookie, and then Aframu. We have an all-star cast and crew in Immortals. They're going to do well regardless of who you plug and play. I think if you were to replace, again, going off this model, replace any top laner, any jungler, any mid laner, any AD carry, any support with the rest of the four remaining pieces of Immortals, they would most likely go 16-2. What a sad realization. They go 16-2. And what we see here is that Aframu is able to take a sort of rookie in Huhi, someone who sat on the bench while Pobelter was starting last year, Stixay, who is filling the shoes of Double Lift, Aframu's longtime teammate and partner, someone that they were able to win the North American Championship as a result of that. Darshan, who's heavily criticized for split pushing, and then someone like Smithy, a veteran who should have retired long ago, according to Reddit. So we can see similar criticisms when it comes to pointing out that Dylan is the coach of Immortals over Zix. I think that given the people, given the talent, given the accolades of these individuals, that CLG is more worthy of a lot of these awards just based on the sheer fact that Aframu is able to do a lot with a little. And that, in a lot of ways, is representative of him as a player and how we should maybe celebrate some of his successes, even though, yes, there's a criticism of him not performing well on the big stage. And I think about this from the perspective, too, of why do we reward Yellow Star for having a team with more talent because they had a perfect season, which I get that. But in a lot of ways, Yellow Star was the glue, right? Given the shakeup that happened to Fnatic, the mass exodus away from the team, Yellow Star was the only piece remaining. He brings back Reckless. He takes these two Korean imports. He makes them godlike. Pabivin is this breakout mid laner. In a lot of ways, that Perks is as well. And so Yellow Star is this seasoned veteran. He took a bunch of rookies. He put them all in a position to succeed. And he was awesome. He was the shot caller. He was the glue guy. His pool of talent was much greater in old Fnatic than Aframu has right now in CLG. So if we were to see CLG maybe place first place, perhaps then we would give him the accolades. But because he's 13-5, what a terrible record, all of a sudden we're more apt to give that MVP to someone else. I think we need to think about the way that we have these discussions. And again, this is just one very nitpicky argument. I'm pretty content with the Trick and the Reign over picks. But I also think there are some considerations that we're not making that we should start thinking about from this point moving forward. Thanks for tuning in to the first episode of Front Page. I'm Mike Blight. Talk to you soon.